The autumn rain drummed against the tin roof of Millbrook Station with the persistence of unanswered prayers. Steam hissed from beneath the departing locomotive as it pulled away into the grey afternoon, leaving behind only the scent of coal. Smoke and broken promises. Among the scattered puddles on the platform, a woman sat perfectly still on a wooden bench, her fingers wrapped around the handle of a worn leather satchel. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Hayes had been waiting for 3 hours. Her unseeing eyes, clouded by the accident that had stolen her sight 2 years prior, remained fixed straight ahead, while her other senses painted the world around her. The station master's heavy. Boots paced behind the ticket window. A stray cat mewed somewhere near the freight cars. The wind carried the distant sound of church bells from the town centre, marking another hour passed in solitude. She wore her best dress, navy blue, with small pearl buttons that her late husband Robert had admired. The fabric still held the faint scent of the lavender sachets she kept in her wardrobe, though now it was dampened by the October chill. Her wedding ring, thin and worn from years of faithful wear, caught what little light filtered through the overcast sky. The letter crumpled in her coat pocket had promised everything. Her brother-in-law, Daniel Hayes, had written from Chicago with news of a job waiting for her at a school for the blind. "Come to Millbrook Station," he had written in his careful script, which her neighbor Mrs. Patterson had read aloud 3 times. "I'll meet the afternoon train on October 15th. We'll start fresh, Margaret. You deserve a new beginning." But Daniel Hayes was nowhere to be found. The platform had emptied of its handful of travelers hours ago. The station master, a thin man with kind eyes who had helped her from the train car, had approached twice to ask if she needed assistance. Each time Margaret had smiled politely and assured him someone was coming. The lie tasted bitter, but admitting abandonment felt worse. She had sold everything to afford the train ticket from Cedar Falls, the small house where she and Robert had spent 5 happy years before the fever took him. The furniture they had chosen together, her mother's china, everything except the satchel containing her few remaining possessions and the hope that somewhere, someone still wanted her. The rain began to ease, replaced by a wind that carried the scent of dying leaves and distant wood smoke. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter and listened to the world around her with the acute attention that blindness had taught her. Footsteps approached, different from the station master's familiar gait. These were heavier, more deliberate, with the slight drag of someone favoring one leg. "Station's closing soon, ma'am." The voice belonged to a man, rough around the edges, but not unkind. There was something careful in his tone, as if he understood that harsh words could cut deeper than intended. Margaret turned toward the sound. "I'm waiting for someone." A pause. She heard him shift his weight, the creak of leather, the soft jingle of spurs. "Been waiting long?" "Not too long." Another lie, easier than the truth. She sensed him studying her, though she couldn't see the way his scarred hands gripped the brim of his hat, or how his weathered face softened with recognition of her circumstances. What she couldn't know was that Sam Mitchell had been watching from the shadows for the better part of an hour, trying to decide whether to approach. Sam had drifted into Millbrook 3 days earlier, following the railroad as he had. For the past 2 years since the mine collapse in Colorado that had left him with a ruined leg and scars that ran deeper than flesh, he wasn't planning to stay. Never did. But something about the woman on the bench, sitting with such dignified patience despite her obvious abandonment, had stirred something in his chest that he'd thought buried with his old life. "Mind if I sit? These old bones don't stand as well as they used to." Margaret nodded, scooting slightly to make room on the bench. The wood dipped under his weight, and she caught the scent of tobacco, leather, and something else. Soap, as if he'd made an effort to clean up before approaching. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. Margaret found herself oddly at ease with this stranger's presence. There was no pity in his manner, no awkward fumbling for words that she'd grown accustomed to since losing her sight. He simply existed beside her, solid and real in a world that had become increasingly uncertain. "I used to know a woman who waited like you do," Sam said eventually. His voice carried the weight of memory. "My sister Emily. After her husband went to war, she'd sit on the porch every evening, listening for his footsteps on the gravel path. Even after the letter came." Margaret's fingers tightened on her satchel handle. "Did she ever stop waiting?" "Eventually. But it took her a long time to learn that sometimes the thing we're waiting for isn't coming back, and that's when we have to decide what comes next." The station master emerged from his office, keys jangling. "I'm sorry, folks, but I need to lock up for the night. Last train north won't come through until tomorrow morning." Margaret's composure faltered for the first time. The careful mask of patience slipped, revealing the fear she'd been holding at bay. Where would she go? She had enough money for perhaps one night at a boarding house, but then what? Return to Cedar Falls with nothing? Admit to the neighbors who had watched her leave with such hope that she'd been cast aside once again? "There's a place called Morrison's Inn about 2 blocks from here," the station master continued, his voice gentle with understanding. "Mrs. Morrison is a good woman. She'll see you right." Sam stood, and Margaret heard the soft grunt of pain that accompanied the movement. "I'll walk you there if you don't mind the company." It wasn't really a question, and Margaret found herself grateful for the presumption. She rose carefully, using the bench for support, and felt Sam's steady presence beside her as they descended the platform steps. The walk to Morrison's Inn revealed the character of Millbrook through Margaret's other senses. The town was smaller than Cedar Falls, quieter. Their footsteps echoed off brick buildings, and she could hear the distant sound of a piano from what might have been a saloon or hotel. The air smelled of coal stoves and cooking food, the comfortable sense of a community settling in for the evening. Sam's limp became more pronounced as they walked, but he never slowed his pace to accommodate her careful steps. Instead, he offered his arm in a way that felt natural rather than patronizing, allowing her to set their rhythm while providing the security of his steadiness. "You're not from around here," Margaret observed. "No, ma'am. Just passing through." "Do you always help stranded women find lodging?" She felt rather than saw his smile. "First time, actually. Must be your lucky day." Morrison's Inn proved to be a 3-story building with a wide front porch and the warm glow of lamplight spilling from its windows. Mrs. Morrison herself answered Sam's knock, a woman whose voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to running her establishment with firm kindness. "Lord have mercy, you're soaked through," she declared upon seeing Margaret. Come in, we'll get you settled and warmed up proper." As they stood in the inn's small lobby, Margaret realized she hadn't properly thanked her unexpected companion. She turned toward where she judged Sam to be standing, extending her hand. "Margaret Hayes, I'm grateful for your kindness, Mr. Mitchell." Sam Mitchell. His hand engulfed hers, calloused and warm despite the evening chill. And it was nothing. Mrs. Hayes. But it wasn't nothing, and they both knew it. In a world that had shown Margaret little kindness since she'd lost both her sight and her husband, Sam's simple human decency felt like a lifeline. "Will you be staying in town long, Mr. Mitchell?" Sam hesitated. He'd been planning to catch the morning freight train, heading west, continuing his aimless journey away from the memories that haunted his sleep. But looking at Margaret Hayes, really looking at her for the first time, he saw something that made him reconsider. She was perhaps 30, with auburn hair that had worked loose from its careful arrangement during the long day of waiting. Her face bore the particular kind of composure that came from facing hardship with dignity intact. But it was her hands that caught his attention. The way they moved with careful precision, the slight tremor that spoke of nerves held rigidly in check, the wedding ring that she still wore despite her obvious widowhood. She was, Sam realized, exactly as lost as he was. The difference was that she was lost in one place while he was lost in motion. "I might stick around for a day or two," he heard himself saying, "see what opportunities Millbrook has to offer." Mrs. Morrison bustled about, preparing Margaret's room and inquiring about supper. Through it all, Sam remained in the lobby, ostensibly, examining the inn's modest furnishings, but actually listening to the sound of Margaret's voice as she answered questions about her circumstances with careful honesty. She was traveling to meet family, she explained. There had been a misunderstanding about the timing. She would need the room for perhaps one night, possibly two, while she sorted things out. Sam understood the careful omissions in her story. He recognized the pride that prevented her from admitting the full extent of her abandonment, because he carried the same pride that kept him moving rather than settling anywhere long enough to be pitied. When Mrs. Morrison finally led Margaret upstairs to her room, Sam found himself alone in the lobby with his thoughts. Through the window, he could see the lights of Millbrook's main street flickering in the darkness. It was a decent town, the kind of place where a man might make an honest living if he was willing to work for it. He thought of Emily, his sister, and her long wait for a husband who would never return. He thought of the mine collapse that had ended his old life and left him wandering like a ghost. He thought of Margaret Hayes, sitting with such perfect dignity on that station platform while the world moved around her. Maybe it was time to stop moving. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost glittering on the inn's front porch. Railings. Sam had spent the night in the inn's stable, bedding down in the hay beside his horse with the permission of the stable boy. It wasn't the first time he'd slept rough, and the familiar scents of leather and horseflesh were more comforting than any featherbed. He was brushing down his mare when he heard voices from the inn's kitchen garden. Through the stable's open door, he could see Margaret Hayes sitting on a wooden bench beside Mrs. Morrison, both women wrapped in shawls against the morning chill. "The thing is, dear," Mrs. Morrison was saying in her practical way, "Millbrook isn't a large town, but it's a good one. We take care of our own here, and that includes folks who find themselves in temporary difficulties." Margaret's voice carried clearly across the yard. "I appreciate your kindness, Mrs. Morrison, but I can't impose indefinitely. I have some funds, but not enough to stay more than another day or two." "Well now, let's not worry about that just yet. The Methodist Church has a women's circle that meets every Wednesday. Good women, all of them, and they're always looking for ways to help. And there's Miss Clara at the schoolhouse. She's been saying she could use an assistant with the younger children." Sam continued grooming his horse while listening to the conversation. Margaret's voice held a note of hope that hadn't been there the evening before, as if a night's rest and Mrs. Morrison's kindness had restored some of her natural optimism. "I taught school before I married," Margaret said. Before I lost my sight. I'm not sure how much help I could be now. Oh, my dear girl, there's more than one way to teach children. You'd be surprised what they can learn from someone who sees the world differently than they do." Sam finished with his horse and walked toward the inn's back entrance, intending to settle his small bill and continue on his way. But as he passed the garden bench, Margaret turned her head toward the sound of his footsteps. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mr. Mitchell, is that you?" He stopped, hat in hand. "Morning, Mrs. Hayes. Mrs. Morrison, I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Mrs. Morrison replied with the brisk efficiency of an innkeeper. "I was just telling Margaret about some of the opportunities here in Millbrook. You wouldn't happen to know if any of the local businesses are looking for help, would you?" Sam considered the question seriously. In his brief time in town, he'd noticed the usual array of establishments that kept a railroad town functioning. A blacksmith, a general store, a grain elevator, several saloons. Most seemed to be family operations, but that didn't mean there weren't opportunities for someone willing to work. The railroad's always looking for section hands, he said, and I noticed the livery stable could use some attention. Paint's peeling, and the owner looked like he could use help with the heavier work. Margaret's head tilted slightly, and Sam realized she was cataloguing his voice, learning to recognize him by sound alone, in the way that blind people did. "What about you, Mr. Mitchell?" she asked. "Are you planning to seek employment here in Millbrook?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Sam wasn't sure he was ready to face. For 2 years, he'd survived by staying in motion, never allowing himself to become attached to people or places that might demand more than he was prepared to give. But there was something about Margaret Hayes that made him want to reconsider that philosophy. "I might," he said, finally. "Depends on what's available." Mrs. Morrison clapped her hands together with the satisfaction of someone who enjoyed arranging other people's lives. "Well then, that settles it. You'll both be staying in Millbrook for a while, at least long enough to see what possibilities present themselves. Margaret, you'll keep your room here as long as you need it. And Mr. Mitchell, I believe there's a small apartment above the saddle shop that Mr. Garrett rents out to reliable men." Sam started to protest that he hadn't actually decided to stay, but the words died in his throat when he saw the expression on Margaret's face. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked genuinely hopeful, as if the possibility of having one familiar face in this strange new town might make all the difference. "That's very kind of you both," Margaret said. "But I should warn you, I'm not accustomed to accepting charity." "Who said anything about charity?" Mrs. Morrison retorted. "You'll earn your keep same as anyone else. Millbrook doesn't coddle folks, but it doesn't abandon them either. You'll work for what you get, and you'll be respected for it." Sam found himself nodding in agreement, though Margaret couldn't see the gesture. Mrs. Morrison's right. This town seems like the kind of place where people make their own way, and so, almost without realizing it, both Margaret Hayes and Sam Mitchell found themselves committed to staying in Millbrook, at least temporarily. Neither could have predicted that this small railroad town would become the place where two broken people would slowly learn to trust again, not just in each other, but in the possibility that life could offer second chances to those brave enough to accept them. The apartment above Garrett's saddle shop smelled of leather oil and wood shavings, scents that reminded Sam of his father's workshop back in Pennsylvania. Before the war changed everything. The room was sparse but clean, a narrow bed, a washstand, one window that faced west toward the railroad tracks, and enough space for a man who owned little more than what he could carry. Henry Garrett, the saddle maker, was a man of few words but keen observation. He'd taken one look at Sam's scarred hands and the careful way he moved and offered work without asking questions about the past. Good hands were good hands, regardless of what had marked them. "Pays not much," Garrett had said, running his fingers. "Along a half-finished bridle, but it's steady and the work's honest. You know leather?" Sam had nodded. He'd learned the basics from his father, and the years of drifting had taught him that a man who could repair tack and harness would never starve. "Room comes with the job, long as you keep it clean and don't bring trouble to my door." Now, 3 days into his tenure in Millbrook, Sam found himself settling into a routine that felt foreign after 2 years of constant movement. He rose before dawn, fed and watered the horses in Garrett's small stable, then spent the morning hours learning to repair the intricate stitching that held saddles together. His fingers, stiff from old injuries, slowly remembered the rhythm of needle and thread. Afternoons brought different work. Shoeing horses when the blacksmith was busy, delivering finished pieces to customers around town, sometimes helping with the heavier lifting that Garrett's aging shoulders couldn't manage. It was good work, the kind that left a man tired in his bones but satisfied in his spirit. But it was the evenings that had begun to matter most. Margaret Hayes had indeed found employment at the Methodist school, though not in the way anyone had expected. Miss Clara Whitman, the head teacher, had been skeptical at first about how a blind woman could assist with children's education. That skepticism had lasted exactly one afternoon. Margaret's first day at the school had coincided with young Timothy Brennan's latest outburst. The 8-year-old had been struggling with his letters, growing increasingly frustrated until he'd finally swept his slate to the floor and declared that he was too stupid to learn anything. While Miss Whitman had stood frozen by the child's display, Margaret had simply walked to where Timothy sat sobbing at his desk. She'd knelt beside his chair, her voice gentle but certain. "Timothy, may I feel your hands?" The boy had been too surprised to refuse. Margaret had taken his small hands in hers, turning them palm up, tracing the lines with her fingertips. "These are carpenter's hands," she'd said with conviction. "See how broad the palms are, how strong are the fingers. My late husband had hands like these. He could build anything, cabinets, houses, beautiful furniture. But you know what he told me once?" Timothy had shaken his head, though Margaret couldn't see the gesture. "He said that reading letters was just like reading wood grain. Both take patience and the right kind of touch. Some people see patterns with their eyes, others feel them with their fingers. Would you like me to show you how letters feel?" What followed had been a revelation. Margaret had guided Timothy's index finger along the smooth slate, helping him trace the shape of letters not as visual symbols but as physical forms with their own texture and weight. The boy's face had transformed as understanding dawned. "The A has 3 lines," he'd whispered, his finger following Margaret's guidance. "2 that lean together and 1 that holds them apart." By the end of that first week, Margaret had revolutionized how the younger children learned their letters. But more than that, she'd begun working with the 3 students who struggled most. Children whose difficulties with traditional learning had marked them as slow or difficult. Sam had heard about Margaret's success from Mrs. Morrison, who delighted in sharing news of her residents' accomplishments. But it wasn't until he encountered Margaret walking home from school one afternoon that he truly understood what she'd achieved. She was moving along Main Street with a confidence that hadn't been there at the train station. Her steps were sure, her head held high, and she carried herself with the bearing of a woman who had found her purpose. But it was the sound of children's voices calling her name from across the street that truly revealed her transformation. Miss Margaret, watch this!" Sam turned to see Timothy Brennan running toward them, his slate held high. The boy skidded to a stop in front of Margaret, breathless with excitement. "I wrote my whole name. Want to feel it?" Margaret smiled, and Sam realized it was the first time he'd seen her face completely free of the careful composure she wore like armor. She was, he thought, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness, and everything to do with the light that shone from within. "Of course I want to feel it, Timothy. But first, do you remember what we practiced about crossing streets safely?" The boy's face grew serious. "Look both ways, even if you're excited, and always stop at the edge first. That's exactly right. Now let me feel this masterpiece of yours." Sam watched as Margaret's fingers traced the letters Timothy had carefully formed. Her face showed genuine pleasure and pride in the child's accomplishment, and Timothy fairly glowed under her attention. "This is beautiful work, Timothy. Your letters are getting so much stronger and clearer. Your mother will be so proud." As the boy ran back to his friends, Sam fell into step beside Margaret. She turned her head toward him, and he realized she'd recognized his footsteps from several yards away. "Mr. Mitchell, how are you settling into Millbrook life?" "Better than expected," he admitted. "Though I have to say, it sounds like you're the one who's made the bigger impression on this town." Margaret's cheeks colored slightly. "The children are wonderful teachers. They don't see limitations the way adults do. To them, learning letters with touch instead of sight is just another game." They walked in comfortable silence for several blocks before Sam spoke again. You mentioned your late husband before. Was he really a carpenter? Robert. Yes, among other things. He had a gift for working with his hands. Woodworking, stone, carving, even some metalwork. He used to say that every material had its own language, and once you learned to listen, it would tell you what it wanted to become. How long has it been? He asked gently. 2 years this past spring. The same fever that took his life damaged my eyes so severely that I lost my sight completely within 6 months. I used to think it was God's way of making sure I never had, to see the world without Robert in it. Sam felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the recognition of someone else's catastrophic loss. And now, Margaret paused at the corner where their paths would diverge, she toward Morrison's Inn, and he toward the saddle shop. Now, I think perhaps I was meant to learn to see the world in a different way. Not better or worse than before, just different. That evening, Sam found himself thinking about Margaret's words as he worked by lamplight, repairing a broken bridle for the morning stage. Her acceptance of her circumstances was something he struggled to understand. How did someone lose everything, spouse, sight, independence, and emerge with such grace? His own losses felt jagged by comparison. The mine collapse had killed 11 men, including his best friend Jake Morrison and young David Chen, barely 18 and newly married. Sam had survived because he'd been working a different section that day, but survivor's guilt was a burden that followed him everywhere he went. The physical injuries, the crushed leg that never healed properly, the scars across his back from falling timber, the damaged lung that made him cough on cold mornings. Those were the visible reminders. The invisible wounds ran deeper. He'd lost faith in permanence, in the idea that building a life was worthwhile when it could all disappear in an instant. But watching Margaret Hayes navigate her new world with such determination was beginning to chip away at his carefully constructed philosophy of detachment. The next morning brought the first real test of Millbrook's acceptance of its newest residents. Sam was delivering a repaired saddle to the livery stable when he overheard a conversation between 2 local merchants. "I'm not saying there's anything wrong with helping folks down on their luck," Walter Hutchins was saying to his companion. "But that blind woman and the drifter who showed up at the same time seems mighty convenient, if you ask me." His companion, a man Sam recognized as the bank clerk, nodded sagely. "My wife heard from Mrs. Patterson that the woman claims to be a widow, but nobody's seen any proof. And what do we really know about either of them?" Sam felt his jaw tighten, but before he could decide whether to intervene, another voice cut through the morning air. "What we know," said Miss Clara Whitman, with the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with unruly children, "is that Margaret Hayes has accomplished more with our struggling students in 2 weeks than we managed in 2 years, and Mr. Mitchell has already proven himself a skilled craftsman and reliable worker." She fixed both men with the stern look that had cowed generations of schoolchildren. "As for proof of anything, Walter Hutchins, I'd remind you that most of us came to Millbrook with nothing more than the clothes on our backs and a willingness to work. Since when do we require people to present credentials for basic human decency?" Walter had the grace to look ashamed, but the bank clerk pressed on. "All I'm saying is that we should be careful about who we let into our community. Some people bring trouble with them." "And some people," Clara replied tartly, "bring gifts we didn't know we needed. I suggest you visit my classroom before you make any more judgments about Margaret Hayes's value to this community." Sam continued on his way, but the conversation stayed with him. He'd lived in enough small towns to know how quickly suspicion could spread and how difficult it could be to overcome once it took root. That afternoon, he made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. Instead of heading straight back to the saddle shop after his deliveries, he stopped by Morrison's Inn. Margaret was sitting on the front porch, her fingers moving deftly through what appeared to be a complex piece of knitting. She looked up at the sound of his footsteps. "Mr. Mitchell, this is a pleasant surprise. I was wondering if you might like to take a walk. There's something I'd like to show you, if you're interested." Margaret set aside her knitting. "I'd like, and that very much." Sam led her away from the main streets, toward the edge of town, where the railroad curved around a small hill crowned with oak trees. It was a place he'd discovered during his evening walks, a spot where a person could see the whole of Millbrook spread out below, while still feeling removed from its concerns. "There's a fallen log here that makes a good seat," he said, guiding Margaret carefully over the uneven ground. "And the view, well, I suppose that doesn't matter much to you." "You'd be surprised," Margaret said, settling beside him on the log. "I may not see the view, but I can smell the wood smoke from the chimneys, hear the sounds of the town settling in for evening, feel the way the air moves differently when you're up high. In some ways, I experience the view more completely than I did when I could see it." They sat quietly for several minutes, listening to the distant sounds of Millbrook's evening routine. Finally, Sam spoke. "I heard some talk today. Nothing serious, just the usual small-town gossip about newcomers. But I thought you should know that some folks are cautious about accepting us." Margaret nodded. "Mrs. Morrison warned me that might happen. She said the key is to keep doing good work and let our actions speak louder than their suspicions. Is that enough for you? Knowing that some people will always question your right to be here?" Margaret was quiet for so long that Sam began to think she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "Mr. Mitchell, may I ask you something personal, I suppose? What happened to your leg?" Sam felt his body tense automatically. It wasn't a question he'd expected, and it certainly wasn't one he was comfortable answering. But something about Margaret's direct approach, no pity, no awkwardness, just honest curiosity, made him consider responding honestly. "Mine collapse in Colorado, 2 years ago this December. Were you the only survivor?" "No, there were others, but sometimes I think the ones who died got the easier bargain." Margaret turned toward him, and though her clouded eyes couldn't see his face, Sam felt as though she was looking directly into his soul. "That's why you keep moving, isn't it? Because staying in one place means having to live with what you survived." Sam had never heard his wandering described so clearly. "I suppose it is. I understand that feeling. After Robert died and I lost my sight, I wanted nothing more than to disappear completely. The idea of facing each day without him, of learning, to navigate a world I could no longer see, felt impossible. What changed?" Margaret smiled, and again Sam was struck by the way her face transformed when she let her guard down completely. "Timothy Brennan, actually. And children like him. I discovered that helping someone else learn to see the world differently gave me a reason to figure out my own new way of seeing." She paused, then reached out and briefly touched Sam's scarred hand. "I think sometimes we survive things not for our own sake, but so we can help others survive them too. Maybe your friend Jake and young David, you mentioned their names in your sleep last night. Voices carry through these in-walls. Maybe they survived in you, so you could use what you learned from losing them." Sam stared at her, shocked both by her insight and by the realization that she'd heard him struggling with nightmares. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted. "Neither did I at first. But staying in one place long enough to try seems like a good beginning." As they made their way back to town in the gathering dusk, Sam realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer just two strangers who had helped each other through a difficult moment. They were becoming something more deliberate, allies perhaps, or friends who understood each other's hidden wounds. The next few weeks brought a routine that felt almost normal. Sam's skill with leatherwork had earned him the respect of Millbrooks. Horsemen and orders for custom pieces began to trickle in. Margaret's reputation as a teacher continued to grow, and parents began requesting her specifically for children who struggled with traditional learning methods. But it was their evening walks that became the foundation of something neither had expected to find again: genuine companionship. They explored every street and path in Millbrook, Margaret learning the town's geography through careful attention to sounds, smells, and the feel of different surfaces under her feet. Sam found himself describing things he'd never thought to notice before: the way sunset light caught the weather vane on the church steeple, the patterns frost made on store windows, the particular shade of gold that autumn leaves became just before they fell. Margaret, in turn, taught Sam to experience the world through senses he'd been neglecting. She showed him how different woods had distinct scents, how you could identify birds by their calls, how the sound of approaching weather changed hours before it arrived. "Listen," she said one evening as they paused near the schoolhouse. "Do you hear that?" Sam stopped and concentrated. "I hear children playing and... Is that singing?" The Methodist choir is practicing in the basement. Mrs. Caldwell always opens the windows when the weather's fine, but listen more carefully to the children. Sam focused on the playground sounds: shouts, laughter, the thud of a ball being kicked. Gradually, he began to distinguish individual voices. "Timothy Brennan is teaching the younger children how to play that hand-clapping game you showed them," Margaret said with satisfaction. "And Mary Patterson is reading aloud to the group by the swing set. They're sharing what they've learned, passing it on to others." Sam realized that Margaret wasn't just describing what she heard. She was celebrating it. For her, the sound of children teaching each other was proof that learning was alive and growing, spreading beyond the confines of formal lessons. "You really love this work," he observed. "I love the possibility of it. Every child who learns to see the world in a new way becomes someone who can help others do the same. It's like planting seeds that will grow long after you're gone." Sam thought about this as they continued their walk. Margaret's vision of education as something that multiplied and spread was completely different from his own experience of learning trades and skills for purely practical purposes. "What about you?" Margaret asked as they reached the hill where they often ended their walks. "Do you think you could love working with leather the way you love it, or is it just something to keep your hands busy?" It was a question Sam had been avoiding, even in his own thoughts. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I haven't let myself love anything for a long time. Seemed safer that way." Safer, perhaps, but not much of a life. Margaret's words stayed with him long after he'd walked her back to Morrison's Inn and climbed the stairs to his small apartment. As he lay in his narrow bed, listening to the distant sound of trains passing through Millbrook, Sam found himself wondering what it would feel like to care deeply about something again, to let himself become invested in the outcome of his work, the well-being of his neighbors, the future of the small community that was slowly becoming home. It was a dangerous thought, one that went against every instinct he'd developed since the mine collapse. But as autumn deepened into winter, and as his friendship with Margaret Hayes continued to grow stronger and more complex, Sam began to suspect that some risks were worth taking. Even if they led to the possibility of loss, they also led to the possibility of something he'd thought he'd given up forever, a reason to stay in one place long enough to build a life worth living. The first snow of winter arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, transforming Millbrook into a hushed wonderland. Of white, Sam discovered it when he stepped outside to feed the horses, his breath forming clouds in the crystalline air. The world had been remade overnight, familiar landmarks softened and reimagined, sounds muffled by the thick blanket that covered everything. His first thought was of Margaret, and how she would experience this transformation. Snow changed everything about navigating by sound and touch, and he found himself genuinely concerned about her safety, walking to and from the school. That concern led him to Morrison's Inn earlier than usual, arriving just as Margaret emerged from the front, Doctor with her usual confident stride. She paused on the porch, tilting her head to listen to the unusual quiet that snow brought to the world. "It snowed," she said with certainty before Sam could speak. "How did you know?" Margaret smiled, pulling her woolen cloak tighter around her shoulders. "The air feels different, thicker somehow, and listen to how our voices sound. Snow absorbs sound differently than rain or ordinary cold." Sam found himself listening more carefully, noting how their conversation seemed to stay close to them, rather than carrying across the street as it usually did. "Would you like me to walk with you to school? The paths might be trickier today." "I'd appreciate that very much." Their walk revealed new challenges that Sam hadn't anticipated. Margaret's usual landmarks, the sound of her footsteps changing from dirt to wooden sidewalk, the particular creak of the general store's porch, the way voices carried from the blacksmith shop, were all muted or altered by the snow. But Margaret adapted with a resilience that continued to amaze Sam. She used her walking stick more deliberately, testing the ground ahead before each step. She paused at corners to listen more carefully for approaching horses or wagons, and she accepted Sam's offered arm without any of the stubborn independence that might have made the journey more difficult for both of them. "This reminds me of learning to navigate my own house after I lost my sight," she said, as they carefully made their way down Main Street. "Everything I thought I knew had to be relearned. The number of steps from the kitchen to the parlor, the height of door frames, which floorboards creaked. It was like becoming a stranger in my own home. That must have been terrifying." It was, but also, in a strange way, it was liberating. When you can't rely on what you think you know, you have to pay attention to what's actually there. I learned things about that house that I'd never noticed in 5 years of living there. Sam considered this as they reached the schoolhouse, where Miss Clara was already sweeping snow from the front steps. "Good morning, Margaret. Mr. Mitchell, how thoughtful of you to escort her. This snow is beautiful, but it does make everything more challenging." "I was just thinking," Sam said, surprising himself with the words, "that Margaret might benefit from having a more regular walking companion during the winter months, if she's agreeable to it." Both women turned to look at him, though Margaret's expression was unreadable, while Clara's showed poorly concealed delight. "That's very considerate of you, Mr. Mitchell," Margaret said carefully, "but I wouldn't want to impose on your time. It wouldn't be an imposition. I'm usually finished with morning chores by the time school starts, and I could easily adjust. My schedule to walk you home in the afternoons." Clara clapped her mittened hands together. "What a perfect solution! And Mr. Mitchell, if you're going to be here regularly anyway, perhaps you'd consider helping with some of our maintenance issues. The school board has been meaning to repair the front steps and the window frames, but we haven't found anyone with the right skills." Sam found himself agreeing before he'd fully considered the implications. Within the space of a 10-minute conversation, he'd committed to spending significantly more time at the school, working closely with Margaret and becoming more integrated into Millbrook's daily life. As he walked back to the saddle shop, Sam realized that Margaret's influence was changing him in ways he hadn't expected. Her approach to challenges, meeting them with practical adaptation rather than resistance or self-pity, was slowly shifting his own perspective. The winter months that followed established a new rhythm for both of them. Sam's morning and afternoon walks with Margaret became as regular as sunrise, and their conversations during these daily journeys revealed layers of personality and experience that deepened their understanding of each other. Margaret told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, where her father had been a minister and her mother a seamstress. She'd been the middle child of 5, the one most likely to be found reading in the hayloft or teaching the younger children elaborate games she'd invented. "I always knew I wanted to teach," she said one morning as they navigated the increasingly familiar snow-covered streets. Even before I understood what teaching really meant, I just loved the moment when someone's face would light up because they'd understood something new. Sam shared fewer stories about his own past, but Margaret's patient attention gradually drew out memories he'd thought buried. His father's workshop, where the scent of sawdust and wood stain had been the backdrop of his childhood. His sister Emily's laughter, bright and infectious until the war changed everything. The sense of possibility he'd felt as a young man before loss taught him that hope was dangerous. "What would you have done if the mine hadn't collapsed?" Margaret asked one afternoon, as they paused to rest on their usual bench outside the schoolhouse. Sam was quiet for so long that Margaret began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a dream long abandoned. "Jake and I had plans to start our own operation. Nothing big, just a small mine with fair wages and safer conditions than what we were working under. We'd saved almost enough money to make it happen. That sounds like it would have made a real difference for other miners. Maybe. We'll never know now." Margaret reached over and briefly touched his hand, a gesture that had become natural between them over the months of walking together. "The knowledge you gained working in those mines, the understanding of what makes conditions safe or dangerous, that didn't die with Jake. It's still part of you." Sam looked at her, struck once again by her ability to see possibilities where he saw only loss. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything specific. I'm just observing that sometimes the dreams we think are dead are really just waiting for new circumstances." Their work at the school had also evolved into something more substantial than either had originally envisioned. Sam's repair work had expanded to include building new shelves for the classroom, constructing a better heating system, and creating specialized learning tools that Margaret designed for her students. Margaret's teaching methods had attracted attention beyond Millbrook. Parents from neighboring towns began bringing children with learning difficulties to observe her classes, and she'd started corresponding with educators from as far away as Chicago who were interested in her techniques. But it was their collaboration on a special project that truly demonstrated how their different skills complemented each other. Young Sarah Fletcher had been born with malformed hands, fingers that had never developed properly. At 12 years old, she was intelligent and eager to learn, but struggled with traditional writing methods. Her parents had been told she would never be able to write legibly, effectively limiting her educational opportunities. Margaret refused to accept this limitation. Working with Sam, she designed a series of adaptive tools that would allow Sarah to hold and manipulate writing instruments effectively. Sam crafted the devices from leather and wood, creating custom grips and supports that accommodated Sarah's unique needs. The day Sarah successfully wrote her first complete sentence was a triumph that brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. But more than that, it demonstrated what could be accomplished when compassion was combined with practical innovation. "You realize what you've done, don't you?" Clara said to Margaret and Sam after Sarah's parents had left with their daughter's proudly displayed writing sample. "You've not just helped one child. You've created a method that could help hundreds of children with similar challenges." Margaret sat quietly, clearly moved by the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. Sam found himself thinking about his conversation with Margaret weeks earlier about dreams that weren't really dead, but simply waiting for new circumstances. "We should document what we've learned," he said suddenly. "Write down the methods, create diagrams of the tools, maybe even train other teachers to use these techniques." Margaret turned toward him with surprise. "That's a wonderful idea, but it would be a tremendous undertaking. It would require months of work, probably travel to other schools, correspondence with educators we've never met." "Are you saying you don't think it's worth doing?" "Not at all. I'm saying it would require a level of commitment to staying in one place, building something permanent, that I wasn't sure you were ready for." Sam realized she was absolutely right. What he was proposing would mean putting down roots in Millbrook in a way he'd been avoiding since his arrival. It would mean investing in the future of this community, accepting responsibility for outcomes he couldn't control. It would mean choosing hope over the safety of detachment. "Maybe I'm more ready than I thought," he said quietly. That evening, Sam found himself walking alone through the snow-covered streets of Millbrook, thinking about the conversation with Margaret. The town looked different to him now than it had when he'd first arrived. Then it had been just another stop on his endless journey away from painful memories. Now he could see it as home. He knew the shopkeepers by name, understood the rhythms of daily life, had friends who counted on him and work that mattered. More importantly, he had Margaret, not just as a companion, but as someone who had helped him rediscover parts of himself he'd thought lost forever. The question was whether he was brave enough to acknowledge what was growing between them. Their friendship had deepened over the months, into something that felt both comfortable and charged with possibility. Margaret's rare smiles were gifts he treasured. The sound of her laughter had become one of his favorite things about their daily walks. And the way she listened, truly listened, when he spoke made him feel heard in a way he hadn't experienced since before the mine collapse. But friendship was safe. Anything beyond friendship carried risks he wasn't sure he was prepared to take. As he passed Morrison's Inn, Sam saw Margaret silhouetted in the front window, sitting by lamplight with what looked like correspondence spread before her. She was working on something, her face thoughtful and focused, completely absorbed in her task. Mrs. Morrison had mentioned that Margaret had been receiving letters from educators in other cities, inquiries about her teaching methods and requests for more information. The work they'd discussed, documenting and sharing their techniques, was already beginning to happen. Sam realized that Margaret was moving forward, with or without his participation. She'd found her purpose and was pursuing it with the same quiet determination she brought to everything else. If he wanted to be part of what she was building, he needed to make that choice consciously and completely. The next morning brought news that would test both of their commitments to Millbrook and to each other. Sam was replacing worn hinges on the schoolhouse door when Miss Clara approached with an expression that mixed excitement and concern. "Margaret, there's someone here to see you. A gentleman from Chicago says he's come specifically to observe your teaching methods." The man who entered the classroom was clearly from the city, well-dressed, confident, carrying himself with the authority of someone accustomed to having his opinions valued. He introduced himself as Dr. William Barnes, director of the Chicago Institute for Progressive Education. "Mrs. Hayes, I've been corresponding with educators throughout the Midwest about innovative teaching methods, and your name has come up repeatedly. I've come to see for myself what you've accomplished here." Margaret received this news with her usual composure, but Sam caught the slight tension in her shoulders that indicated she was feeling the weight of unexpected scrutiny. "You're welcome to observe our classes, Dr. Barnes, though I should warn you that our methods are quite different from traditional approaches. That's exactly what I'm hoping to see." What followed was the most impressive demonstration of Margaret's abilities that Sam had ever witnessed. She worked with her students, including Timothy, Sarah, and several others, with various learning challenges, showing Dr. Barnes how tactile learning, adaptive tools, and individualized instruction could overcome obstacles that traditional education considered insurmountable. Dr. Barnes took extensive notes, asked thoughtful questions, and by the end of the day was clearly impressed by what he'd observed. "Mrs. Hayes, what you've accomplished here is remarkable. These methods could revolutionize how we approach education for children with diverse learning needs." "That's very kind of you to say, Dr. Barnes. I'm not being kind, I'm being practical. The Chicago Institute is prepared to offer you a position as our Director of Specialized Education. You would have resources, support staff, and the opportunity to train teachers from throughout the region. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and Sam felt his heart sink. Of course she would be offered opportunities that Millbrook couldn't match. Of course her talents would be recognized by people who could provide her with the platform she deserved. That's a generous offer, Dr. Barnes. Might I have some time to consider it? Certainly, but I should mention that we would need your answer soon, and you would need to be in Chicago by the 1st of the year to begin the winter term. After Dr. Barnes left to catch the evening train, Margaret and Sam walked home through the early winter darkness in unusual silence. Finally, as they reached Morrison's Inn, Margaret spoke. It's an incredible opportunity. Yes, it is. The kind of chance to make a real difference that most teachers never get. I know. Margaret stopped walking and turned toward him. Sam, what do you think I should do? The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither had been willing to acknowledge directly. Sam realized that his answer would determine not just Margaret's future, but his own. I think, he said carefully, that you should do whatever will make you happiest and allow you to help the most people. That's not really an answer. It's the only answer I can give you. This has to be your choice, Margaret. She stood quietly for a moment, her face unreadable in the lamplight spilling from the inn's windows. You're right, of course, but I was hoping you might have an opinion about whether what we've built here in Millbrook is worth preserving. Sam felt the full weight of what she was really asking, not just about her career, but about them, about whether what had grown between them was substantial enough to influence major life decisions. I think, he said quietly, that what we've built here is the most valuable thing I've ever been part of. But I also think you deserve every opportunity to share your gifts with the world. Margaret reached out and found his hand in the darkness. And what about you, Sam Mitchell? What do you deserve? It was a question he'd never learned how to answer, and as they stood together in the snow-covered street, Sam realized that Margaret's decision would force him to finally figure out what he was brave enough to want from life. The letter arrived 3 days before Christmas, delivered by a boy on horseback who'd ridden hard from the telegraph office in Cedar Falls. Margaret was in her room at Morrison's Inn, carefully wrapping small gifts she'd made for her students, when Mrs. Morrison knocked softly on her door. Margaret, dear, there's correspondence for you. Looks urgent. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she felt the envelope's expensive paper and official seal. She'd been expecting word from Chicago about their deadline for her response, but something about this letter felt different, heavier, more consequential. Mrs. Morrison, would you mind reading it to me? The older woman settled into the room's single chair and carefully opened the envelope. Her sharp intake of breath told Margaret everything she needed to know before the first words were spoken. Dear Mrs. Hayes, Mrs. Morrison began, her voice unusually formal, we regret to inform you that your brother-in-law, Daniel Hayes, was killed in a factory accident in Chicago on December 18th. As his only known relative, you are named as beneficiary of his estate, which includes a modest savings account and a small house on Elm Street in Cedar Falls. Margaret felt the familiar sensation of the world shifting beneath her feet. The way it had when Robert died, when she'd lost her sight, when she'd been abandoned at Millbrook Station. But this time, the shift felt different. Not catastrophic, but unsettling in its implications. Mrs. Morrison continued reading. Mr. Hayes left instructions with his attorney indicating deep regret about a misunderstanding that prevented him from meeting you at Millbrook Station as planned. He had been detained by serious illness and was unable to send word. His final wishes were that you should know he never intended to abandon you, and that he had been working to remedy the situation at the time of his death. The letter concluded with legal details about claiming the inheritance, but Margaret barely heard them. Her mind was processing the revelation that Daniel Hayes hadn't deliberately abandoned her after all, the abandonment that had brought her to Millbrook, that had led to her friendship with Sam, her work at the school, her entire new life. It had all been based on a misunderstanding. "Margaret?" Mrs. Morrison's voice was gentle. "Are you all right, dear?" "I need some air," Margaret said, rising unsteadily. "Could you ask Mr. Mitchell to meet me at our usual place on the hill? Tell him it's important." Sam arrived at their favorite spot to find Margaret sitting on the snow-covered log, staring sightlessly into the distance. Her usual composure was intact, but he could sense the tension radiating from her like heat from a forge. "Mrs. Morrison said you received news." Margaret handed him the letter without speaking. Sam read it twice, understanding immediately why. She wanted to see him, so he didn't abandon you after all. No, he was sick, probably dying even when he wrote asking me to come. And I've spent all these months building a life based on the belief that no one wanted me. Sam sat beside her, careful not to crowd her space, while she processed this new information. "Does it change anything?" he asked quietly. "I don't know. Does it change anything for you?" It was a fair question. Sam had to admit that part of what had drawn him to Margaret was their shared experience of abandonment. Her by Daniel Hayes, him by a world that had taken away everything he'd cared about. If her abandonment had been unintentional, did that alter the foundation of their understanding? "It changes the story," he said slowly, "but not the result. You're still here. We still found each other. What we've built together is still real." Margaret nodded, but Sam could tell she was still working through the implications. "There's more, though. The house in Cedar Falls, it's mine now. I could go back, live independently without relying on anyone's charity or kindness. Is that what you want? I don't know what I want anymore. A week ago, I thought my choices were between staying in Millbrook with people who've become family or going to Chicago to pursue professional recognition. Now there's a third option, returning to the life I had before, but with the security I never had when Robert and I were struggling to make ends meet." Sam felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced in the mine. Moments before the collapse, the sense that everything solid was about to give way. "What does your heart tell you?" Margaret was quiet for so long that Sam began to think she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My heart is terrified of making the wrong choice." "Again?" "What do you mean, again?" Margaret turned toward him, and in the pale winter light, Sam could see tears she was trying not to shed. "I chose to marry Robert when I was 19, even though my parents thought I was too young. I chose to move away from everyone I knew, to start fresh with him. I chose to trust that love was enough to build a life on. And when he died, I felt like those choices had led me into a trap I couldn't escape from." Sam understood. "So now you don't trust your own judgment." "Exactly. What if I choose to stay in Millbrook and it's the wrong decision? What if I choose Chicago and miss out on something important here? What if I go back to Cedar Falls and spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been?" Sam reached over and took her gloved hand in his. It was a gesture they'd shared many times, but this time it felt weighted with significance. "Margaret, can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" She nodded. "The morning of the mine collapse, I almost didn't go to work. I'd been thinking about quitting, maybe taking Jake up on his offer to start our own operation sooner than we'd planned. But I was afraid of the risk, afraid of disappointing people who were counting on me, afraid of failing." Sam paused, remembering that terrible morning with painful clarity. "So I made the safe choice. I went to work like always, kept my head down, didn't rock the boat. And that safe choice put me in the mine shaft when the timber gave way." Margaret squeezed his hand, understanding what he was telling her. "The men who died that day, they made the same safe choice I did. And the life I've been living since, constantly moving to avoid commitment or risk, that's been another version of the same safe choice." "What are you saying?" I'm saying that maybe the mistake isn't in making the wrong choice. Maybe the mistake is in trying to choose the safe option instead of the true one. Margaret was quiet, processing his words. Finally, she spoke. And what feels true to you, Sam? It was the question he'd been avoiding for months, the one that would require him to admit what he'd been afraid to acknowledge, even to himself. What feels true to me is that I want to build something with you. Not just the teaching methods or the adaptive tools, but a life, a real life, in one place, with someone who matters more to me than my own safety. Margaret's breath caught, and Sam realized he'd finally said the words that had been hovering between them for weeks. I'm in love with you, Margaret. I have been for months, but I've been too afraid to admit it, because loving someone means risking loss again. Margaret turned fully toward him, her face reflecting a mixture of joy and terror. Sam, you don't have to say anything right now. I just needed you to know where I stand before you make your decision about Chicago or Cedar Falls or staying here. But Margaret was shaking her head. You don't understand. I was going to say that I'm in love with you too. I have been since the day you helped me repair the schoolhouse roof in that thunderstorm, when I realized you weren't just kind. You were brave enough to stay when things got difficult. Sam felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of fear and loneliness that had been there so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. Then why do you look so scared? Because loving you makes all three choices more complicated. If I go to Chicago, I'm leaving behind the most important relationship I've had since Robert died. If I go back to Cedar Falls, I'm asking you to give up the life you've built here. And if I stay in Millbrook, if you stay in Millbrook, what? If I stay, it has to be because it's the right choice for me, not just because it's where you are. I can't build my life around another person's presence again, even yours. I learned that lesson when Robert died. Sam understood what she was saying, even though it wasn't what he wanted to hear. Margaret needed to choose her path based on her own needs and goals, not on romantic attachment. It was the mature, responsible approach, and it scared him more than any mind collapse ever had. How long do you need to decide? Dr. Barnes wants an answer by New Year's Day. The estate attorney says I can take possession of the Cedar Falls house anytime, so I suppose I have a week to figure out the rest of my life. They sat together as darkness fell around them, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Sam spoke. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that knowing you has changed me. You've helped me remember what it feels like to hope for something, to work toward a future instead of just running from the past. You've done the same for me. Before I met you, I thought the best I could hope for was learning to cope with loss. You've shown me that it's possible to build something new and beautiful even after everything falls apart. As they walked back to town together, Sam realized that their conversation had shifted something fundamental between them. They'd moved beyond friendship into acknowledged love, but that love now carried the weight of difficult choices and uncertain futures. The week between Christmas and New Year passed with agonizing slowness. Margaret threw herself into her work with the children, as if teaching them could help her sort through her own confusion. Sam focused on completing an intricate leatherworking project, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of craftsmanship. But they couldn't avoid each other entirely. Their daily walks continued, though the conversations were more careful now, both of them aware that every shared moment might be leading toward goodbye. On New Year's Eve, the town held its annual celebration. In the church hall, Margaret had planned to attend alone, needing space to think, but Mrs. Morrison insisted she needed an escort. It's not proper for a lady to attend social functions unaccompanied, the older woman declared. Besides, Mr. Mitchell has been moping around like a lost calf all week. You'll be doing us all a favor by giving him something to do. So Margaret found herself walking into the decorated hall on Sam's arm, aware that everyone in Millbrook was watching them with the keen interest of small towns reserved for potential romantic developments. The evening proceeded normally enough. Music, dancing, conversation about the year past and the year ahead. But as midnight approached, Sam and Margaret found themselves standing together on the church steps, away from the crowded hall. "Have you decided?" Sam asked quietly. Margaret nodded. "I have, but I want to ask you something first. Anything. If I choose to stay in Millbrook, would you be willing to help me start something new? Not just continuing what we've been doing, but something bigger. A real school for children with learning differences, maybe a training center for teachers who want to learn these methods." Sam felt his heart begin to race. That would require significant investment, probably partners or funding from outside sources. It would be a huge undertaking. Yes, it would. It would also require both of us to commit to staying here long term, building something that might take years to fully establish. Sam understood what she was really asking. Not just whether he'd be willing to work with her, but whether he was ready to plant roots so deep that leaving would no longer be an option. "Margaret, if you're willing to take that risk, then so am I." She smiled, and even in the dim light from the church windows, Sam could see the way her face transformed with genuine joy. "Then I'm staying. Not just for you, though that's part of it, but because this is where I can do the most good, where the work we've started can grow into something that really matters." As the church bell began to toll at midnight, Sam pulled Margaret into his arms and kissed her for the first time. It was a kiss that tasted of new beginnings and hard-won hope, of two people who had learned that love was worth the risk of loss. When they broke apart, Margaret rested her forehead against his. "I should probably write to Dr. Barnes tomorrow and decline his offer, and I should probably talk to Henry Garrett about expanding the workshop. If we're going to be building specialized furniture and teaching tools, we'll need more space." They stood together on the church steps, making plans for a future neither had been brave enough to imagine a year ago. Around them, Millbrook celebrated the arrival of 1885, but for Margaret and Sam, the real celebration was just beginning. They had chosen each other, chosen this place, chosen to build something lasting, despite all the reasons to play it safe. It was the kind of choice that required daily renewal, ongoing commitment, and faith in possibilities they couldn't guarantee. But as they walked home through the snow-covered streets of the town that had become their refuge and their opportunity, both Margaret and Sam understood that some risks were worth taking, and some foundations were strong enough to build a lifetime on. Spring arrived in Millbrook with the intensity of a promise finally kept. The snow melted in rushing torrents that turned the streets to mud and filled the air with the scent of earth awakening. Margaret stood in the doorway of what would soon become the Millbrook Institute for Progressive Learning, breathing in the mixture of sawdust, paint, and possibility that permeated the old warehouse they'd purchased with her inheritance money. The past 4 months had transformed both their lives and the building before her. What had once been a grain storage facility was becoming something unprecedented in their part of the country, a school specifically designed for children whose minds worked differently than their peers expected. The new desks arrived this morning, Sam called from somewhere in the building's depths. His voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd found his true calling, and the adaptive writing tools from the Chicago supplier. Margaret smiled, following the sound of his voice through the maze of construction. Sam had thrown himself into the project with an enthusiasm that amazed everyone who'd known him as the quiet, distant drifter who'd arrived the previous fall. Now he was designing custom furniture, coordinating with craftsmen from 3 counties, and corresponding with educators from as far away as Boston about their innovative teaching methods. She found him in what would be the primary classroom, assembling a desk that could be adjusted for children of different heights and physical capabilities. His scarred hands moved with practiced precision, and Margaret noticed that the slight tremor that had been there when she first met him had disappeared entirely. "You're humming," she observed. Sam looked up, surprised. "I am?" "The same tune you were humming yesterday when you were installing the tactile learning boards. I think it's becoming your signature." "I didn't realize." Sam set down his tools and wiped his hands on his apron. "I guess I'm happy." The simple statement carried weight beyond its words. Margaret understood that for Sam, admitting to happiness was like acknowledging that he'd chosen to trust the future, despite all the evidence that futures could be destroyed without warning. "Dr. Barnes wrote again," Margaret said, settling carefully onto a completed bench. "The Chicago Institute is hosting a conference this summer on innovative educational methods. They've invited us to present our work." Sam paused in his assembly. "Work? That's a significant opportunity. National recognition for what we're building here." "It is. But it would also mean leaving Millbrook for several weeks, right when we're preparing to open our doors to students." This was the kind of decision they'd been facing regularly since committing to the Institute. Every opportunity that came their way forced them to balance their growing ambitions against their dedication to the local community that had made their work possible. "What does your instinct tell you?" Sam asked. It was a question he'd learned to ask instead of immediately offering his own opinion. Margaret's ability to sense the right course of action had proven remarkably accurate, but only when she trusted her intuition instead of over-analyzing the possibilities. "My instinct says we're not ready yet. The work here is too new, too fragile, to leave for that long. But in a year or two, when we've proven what's possible in Millbrook, then we'll have something substantial to share with the wider world." Sam nodded, understanding her reasoning. "So we decline for now, but leave the door open for future collaboration." Exactly. This kind of partnership, practical, respectful, built on genuine understanding of each other's strengths, had become the foundation of everything they were building together. Margaret brought vision and pedagogical innovation. Sam provided practical implementation and business acumen neither had known he possessed. But their collaboration extended far beyond professional partnership. In the months since New Year's Eve, their relationship had deepened into something that surprised them both with its complexity and richness. They'd established routines that honored both Margaret's need for independence and their desire to share daily life. Margaret had moved from Morrison's Inn to a small house near the Institute, while Sam had expanded his quarters above the saddle shop to include a proper workshop. They spent their days working side by side on the school project, their evenings walking through Millbrook's familiar streets, and their quiet moments, discovering the 1,000 small intimacies that made up a genuine partnership. "There's something else we need to discuss," Margaret said, her tone suggesting the topic was significant. "Mrs. Patterson from Cedar Falls came by yesterday while you were in town ordering supplies." Sam looked up sharply. Margaret's former neighbor had been writing regularly since news of the Institute had spread, but this was her first personal visit. What did she want? "To tell me that there are people in Cedar Falls who think I've lost my mind. Apparently, word has gotten out about a blind woman starting a school, and the reaction has been mixed." Sam felt his jaw tighten. "What kind of reaction?" "The kind that questions whether someone with my limitations should be trusted with children's education. Mrs. Patterson wanted to warn me that there might be organized opposition when we formally open." This was the challenge Margaret had been dreading. While Millbrook had come to accept and celebrate her unconventional methods, the wider world was less progressive in its attitudes toward disability and education. What kind of organized opposition? Petitions, "Oh, to the State Education Board questioning our credentials, requests for inspections to ensure we're meeting proper standards, possibly even attempts to prevent parents from sending children here." Sam set down his tools and moved to sit beside Margaret on the bench. "Are you worried?" "I'm concerned, but not in the way I would have been a year ago." "What's different?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "A year ago, I would have been afraid that opposition meant I was wrong, that my limitations really did disqualify me from teaching. Now I'm afraid that opposition might prevent us from helping children who need what we offer." Sam understood the distinction. Margaret's fear had shifted from self-doubt to protective concern for their potential students. "We'll document everything," he said practically. "Keep detailed records of every student's progress, maintain correspondence with respected educators who support our methods, ensure that everything we do exceeds standard requirements. That will help with official challenges. But what about parents who are simply afraid to trust their children to someone they perceive as disabled?" It was a question that cut to the heart of the prejudices they'd be fighting for years to come. Sam had watched Margaret work with dozens of children over the past months, had seen her achieve results that amazed parents and traditional teachers alike. But he also understood that fear and ignorance could be more powerful than evidence. "Then, we prove them wrong one child at a time," he said simply, "just like we've been doing." Margaret reached for his hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. "It won't be easy. The worthwhile things never are." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Timothy Brennan, now 9 years old, and Margaret's most enthusiastic advocate. The boy burst through the front door with the energy of someone carrying important news. "Miss Margaret, Mr. Sam, you have to come see what Mary Patterson did." Timothy had been helping with small tasks around the construction site, earning a few pennies while learning skills that weren't taught in traditional classrooms. But more importantly, he'd become an informal ambassador for their methods, sharing his own success story with other children and parents. They followed Timothy outside, where they found Mary Patterson, the bank clerk's daughter, who had struggled with reading despite obvious intelligence, demonstrating the tactile letter recognition method to a group of younger children. "See, you don't just look at the letter," Mary was explaining with the patience of someone who'd learned through struggle. "You feel how it's shaped. The B has 2 bumps on the right side, but the P only has 1 bump at the top." Margaret listened with pride as Mary guided the younger children through the same exercises that had transformed her own learning experience. But more than that, she was witnessing the multiplication effect she'd hoped for. Children who'd been helped, becoming teachers themselves. "Word spreading," Sam observed quietly, "not just about our methods, but about what's possible when children are allowed to learn differently." "That's both encouraging and dangerous," Margaret replied. "Success brings attention, and attention brings scrutiny." Their concerns proved prophetic. The next week brought their first official visitor, State Inspector Jonathan Hartwell, a thin man with precise movements and an expression that suggested he'd already formed negative opinions about what he expected to find. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, settling into their small office with obvious skepticism, "I've received reports about your unconventional teaching methods. The State Board of Education has asked me to evaluate whether your proposed institution meets minimum standards for educational facilities." Margaret had prepared for this moment, but facing actual official scrutiny felt different from planning for it. Sam, who'd positioned himself near the window where he could see but wouldn't be intrusive, gave her an encouraging nod. "Of course, Mr. Hartwell, we welcome the opportunity to demonstrate our methods and facilities." What followed was the most thorough examination Margaret had ever experienced. Inspector Hartwell questioned every aspect of their approach, The adaptive furniture, the tactile learning materials, the individualized instruction methods, even the qualifications of their volunteer assistants. But Margaret had learned something important about confidence over the past year. Instead of becoming defensive or apologetic, she simply showed him what worked. She demonstrated the tactile letter recognition system with children who'd previously been labeled as slow learners. She showed him Sarah Fletcher's beautiful handwriting, achieved through adaptive tools. She presented detailed progress records for every student they'd worked with. Most importantly, she let the children themselves explain what they'd learned and how they'd learned it. "Traditional methods told me I was stupid," Timothy Brennan said with the directness of childhood. "Miss Margaret showed me I was just learning differently. Now I can read better than kids who are older than me." Inspector Hartwell spent 3 days observing classes, interviewing parents, and reviewing documentation. His initial skepticism gradually gave way to professional curiosity, then grudging respect. "Mrs. Hayes," he said on his final day, "I came here expecting to find a well-intentioned but misguided experiment. What I found instead is the most innovative and effective educational approach I've encountered in 20 years of school inspection." Margaret felt relief flood through her, but Hartwell wasn't finished. "However, I must warn you that not everyone will be as open-minded as I've tried to be. Your methods challenge fundamental assumptions about how children learn and who is qualified to teach them. You should expect continued resistance from some quarters." "We understand," Margaret replied, "but we also believe that children's needs should come before adults' comfort with traditional approaches." Inspector Hartwell nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right attitude. I'll be recommending full accreditation for the Millbrook Institute for progressive learning, with the notation that your methods represent a significant advancement in educational practice." After Hartwell left, Margaret and Sam found themselves alone in the completed school building for the first time. Construction was finished, equipment installed, curriculum developed, and official approval secured. In 3 weeks, they would welcome their first class of students. "We did it," Sam said, his voice carrying wonder at their accomplishment. "We did." Margaret moved through the familiar space, running her hands along surfaces she'd helped design, touching tools and furniture that represented months of collaborative vision made real. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Margaret considered the question seriously. Opening the school was just the beginning. They'd be facing skeptical parents, challenging students, ongoing financial pressures, and the constant need to prove that their methods produced lasting results. "I'm terrified," she admitted, "and more excited than I've ever been about anything." Sam moved to stand beside her in the main classroom, where afternoon sunlight streamed through windows positioned to provide optimal lighting for children with various visual needs. "Margaret, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." Something in his tone made her turn toward him fully, giving him her complete attention. "We've built something extraordinary here together. Not just the school, but us. The partnership. The life we're sharing. The future we're planning." Margaret's heart began to beat faster, sensing the direction of his words. "I know we've talked about commitment, about choosing to stay in one place and build something lasting, but I want to make it official. I want to marry you, Margaret, not because either of us needs rescuing, but because what we've created together is worth celebrating and protecting." Margaret felt tears she hadn't expected beginning to form. "Sam Mitchell, are you proposing to me in our schoolroom before we've even taught our first official class?" "I guess I am." "Is that too practical for romance?" Margaret laughed, reaching up to touch his face with hands that knew every line and scar by heart. "It's perfect. It's exactly right. Because this place, this work, this partnership, it's all part of the same choice. The choice to believe in building something beautiful, even when the world tells us it's impossible. Is that a yes?" "That's a yes to everything." to marriage, to the school, to whatever challenges and opportunities come next, to building a life that's bigger than either of us could have imagined alone. Sam kissed her then in the classroom where they'd soon begin teaching children that different ways of learning were sources of strength rather than limitation. It was a kiss that tasted of sawdust and dreams made real, of two people who'd learned that love and work and hope could be woven together into something strong enough to change the world, one child at a time. Outside, Millbrook continued its quiet rhythm of daily life, unaware that within the walls of an old warehouse, two people had just committed to a future that would touch hundreds of lives and challenge assumptions that had limited possibilities for generations. The Millbrook Institute for Progressive Learning would open its doors in 3 weeks. But for Margaret Hayes and Sam Mitchell, the real opening had already begun. The opening of hearts brave enough to love, minds creative enough to innovate, and spirits determined enough to prove that what seemed impossible was simply waiting for the right people to make it real. The autumn of 1885 brought changes to Millbrook that no one could have predicted when Margaret Hayes first sat abandoned on the train station platform nearly 2 years earlier. The Millbrook Institute for Progressive Learning had not only opened successfully, but had become a destination for families from across 3 states seeking educational alternatives for their children. Margaret stood in the expanded classroom, listening to the sounds of 23 students engaged in various learning activities. The gentle scratch of adapted writing tools, the soft murmur of children helping each other with difficult concepts, the occasional burst of laughter when someone mastered a particularly challenging skill. These had become the soundtrack of her daily life. Mrs. Mitchell called 8-year-old James Winters, who had arrived from Indiana with a stutter so severe that previous teachers had assumed he couldn't learn. "Could you help me with this arithmetic problem?" The name still sent a warm flutter through Margaret's chest. She and Sam had married in June, in a simple ceremony in the Methodist church with half of Millbrook in attendance. Mrs. Morrison had wept openly, claiming credit for bringing them together, while Henry Garrett had presented Sam with a beautifully crafted leather portfolio as a wedding gift. Margaret made her way to James's desk, her movements through the classroom now so fluid that visitors often forgot she couldn't see the children she was helping. "Tell me about the problem," she said, settling beside him. "It's about sharing apples equally," James said, his stutter barely noticeable when he was focused on learning. "If there are 12 apples and 4 children, how many does each child get?" Margaret smiled. James had progressed remarkably since his arrival, but arithmetic still challenged him because previous teachers had insisted on visual methods that didn't match how his mind processed information. "Let's use the counting blocks," she suggested. "Can you feel 12 blocks and group them into 4 equal sets?" As James worked through the problem with his hands, Margaret reflected on how much their understanding of learning differences had evolved. What had started as accommodations for her own blindness had developed into a comprehensive philosophy about multiple ways of understanding the world. The success had not come without challenges. The opposition from Cedar Falls had materialized into a formal complaint filed with the State Education Board, questioning whether a blind woman could properly supervise children's safety. Margaret had spent weeks preparing detailed responses and gathering testimonials from parents and students. More difficult had been the personal attacks in the regional newspaper, articles that questioned her qualifications and suggested that her methods were coddling children who needed to learn to adapt to normal expectations rather than having the world adapted to them. But for every critic, they'd found 2 advocates. Parents whose children had flourished under Margaret's teaching became fierce defenders of the Institute. Timothy Brennan's mother had organized a letter-writing campaign to counter the negative newspaper coverage. Sarah Fletcher's parents had traveled to the state capitol to testify about their daughter's progress. Mrs. Mitchell, the voice belonged to Emma Reynolds, their newest teacher and Margaret's first formal apprentice. Emma had arrived from Chicago after hearing about their methods from Dr. Barnes, determined to learn techniques she could take back to urban schools. "What can I help you with, Emma? There's a gentleman here to see you. Says he's from the Department of Education in Washington." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Federal attention was something they'd hoped to avoid until their methods were more established and documented. "Did he give his name?" "Charles Whitman. He says he's been following reports of our work and would like to observe our classes." Margaret nodded calmly, though her mind was racing. A federal education official could either validate their work on a national level or create problems that would be much more difficult to overcome than local opposition. "Please show him to the office. I'll be there shortly." Margaret finished, helping James with his arithmetic, made sure the other students were settled with their various activities, and then made her way to the small office she shared with Sam. Charles Whitman proved to be a soft-spoken man in his 50s, with the careful manner of someone accustomed to observing rather than directing. Unlike State Inspector Hartwell's barely concealed skepticism, Whitman seemed genuinely curious about what he might learn. "Mrs. Mitchell, I appreciate you taking time to meet with me. I've been reading reports about your institute with great interest. The department is particularly intrigued by your success with children who have struggled in traditional educational settings." "We're always happy to share our methods with other educators," Margaret replied carefully. "Excellent. I was hoping to observe classes for several days, if that would be acceptable. I'm also interested in speaking with parents and students about their experiences." Margaret agreed, though she couldn't shake the feeling that this visit represented a turning point for the Institute. Federal recognition could open doors to funding, partnerships with other schools, and validation that would silence many critics. But it could also bring unwanted oversight and pressure to conform to standards that might not fit their innovative approaches. Over the next 3 days, Charles Whitman became a quiet presence in their classrooms. He watched Margaret work with students who had various learning challenges, observed Sam's demonstrations of adaptive tools and furniture, and interviewed parents about their children's progress. But it was his conversation with the students themselves that seemed to affect him most profoundly. "Before I came here, teachers said I was slow," 10-year-old Maria Santos told him with matter-of-fact honesty. "Mrs. Mitchell says I'm not slow. I just learn by touching and moving instead of sitting still and looking at books." "And now?" Whitman asked gently. "Now I can read better than my older brother, and I'm teaching my little sister how to count using blocks like Mrs. Mitchell showed me." Similar conversations with other students painted a picture of children who had been labeled as problems or failures in traditional schools, but were thriving in an environment that recognized their individual learning styles. On his final day, Whitman requested a private meeting with Margaret and Sam together. "I need to be direct with you both," he began. "What you've accomplished here is remarkable. The documentation you've provided, the student progress I've observed, the parent testimonials, everything points to educational methods that are significantly more effective than traditional approaches for a substantial percentage of children." Margaret felt cautiously optimistic, but Whitman's serious tone suggested there was more to come. "However, you should know that your work has attracted attention from educators who feel threatened by what you represent. There are those who argue that specialized methods like yours undermine the authority of traditional teaching and create unrealistic expectations about accommodating individual differences." Sam leaned forward. "What kind of opposition are we talking about?" "The kind that has political influence. There's a movement building to establish more rigid national education standards, with the argument that consistency and uniformity are more important than individual accommodation." Margaret understood the implications immediately, "and our methods would be seen as contrary to that goal." Exactly, which is why I'm here not just to observe, but to document everything you're doing. Before political pressures might force changes, Whitman paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. I'm prepared to recommend that the Department of Education fund a comprehensive study of your methods, with the goal of developing training programs for teachers in other regions. But I need to warn you that such recognition would also make you a more visible target for opposition. Margaret and Sam exchanged glances, communicating in the wordless way they'd developed over months of partnership. Mr. Whitman, Margaret said finally, we didn't start this work to avoid controversy. We started it because children were being failed by a system that couldn't see past their differences to their potential. And if expanding our influence means facing more opposition, then that's a risk we're willing to take, Sam added. Whitman smiled for the first time since his arrival. I was hoping you'd say that, because I believe what you're doing here could change education throughout the country if we can build enough support to overcome the resistance. After Whitman left, promising to send detailed proposals within a month, Margaret and Sam found themselves alone in their office as evening settled over Millbrook. We're really going to do this, aren't we? Sam said. Take on the entire educational establishment, Margaret laughed. I think we already have. We just didn't realize the scope of what we'd started. Are you worried? Margaret considered the question seriously. A year ago, the prospect of national attention and potential conflict would have terrified her, but the months of successfully running the institute had given her a different kind of confidence. I'm concerned about what opposition might mean for our students and their families. But I'm not worried about our methods or our mission. We know what works because we see it every day. Sam moved to stand behind her chair, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. What if the federal study leads to demands that we change our approach to fit national standards? Then we'll have to decide whether we can maintain our principles within those constraints, or whether we need to find different ways to serve the children who need us. It was a conversation that would be repeated many times over the coming months, as the Institute's success continued to attract both acclaim and criticism. But that evening, in the quiet of their shared office, Margaret and Sam were simply grateful for what they'd built together. Do you ever think about that day at the train station? Sam asked quietly. Which aspect of it? The fact that if Daniel Hayes hadn't died, if there hadn't been a misunderstanding, you would have gone to Chicago and we never would have met. Margaret turned in her chair to face him. I think about it sometimes. But then I remember something my mother used to say, that life doesn't happen to us, it happens through us. We make choices every day about how to respond to what comes our way. And you think we would have found each other somehow, even if circumstances had been different? Margaret reached for his hands, scarred but steady, capable of creating beautiful things from raw materials. I think we were both ready to stop running from our losses and start building something meaningful. Maybe it would have happened in Chicago, or maybe in some other town where two broken people decided to help each other heal. Sam squeezed her hands gently. I prefer the version where it happened here, where we could create something that serves other people too. So do I. Outside their window, Millbrook settled into its evening rhythm. Lights flickered on in houses where families gathered for dinner, discussing their days and making plans for tomorrow. The town had embraced the Institute as part of its identity now, proud to be home to something innovative and important. But inside the building that had been a grain warehouse when two strangers first recognized each other's wounds, Margaret and Sam Mitchell were planning for a future that would reach far beyond their small railroad town. The federal study, when it came, would validate their methods and lead to training programs in a dozen states. The opposition would be fierce, but ultimately unsuccessful, as evidence mounted that children thrived when their individual differences were seen as strengths rather than deficits. Years later, When historians wrote about the transformation of American education in the late 19th century, they would point to the Millbrook Institute as a turning point, the place where a blind widow and a scarred drifter proved that innovation could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. But that autumn evening in 1885, Margaret and Sam were simply two people who had chosen love over fear, partnership over solitude, and hope over resignation. They had built something beautiful from the ruins of their separate losses, and in doing so had created opportunities for countless others to do the same. The train whistle sounded in the distance, carrying new travelers toward unknown destinations. But for the first time since losing everything that had once defined them, both Margaret and Sam Mitchell were exactly where they belonged, not because they had nowhere else to go, but because they had chosen to plant roots deep enough to support not just their own growth, but a forest of possibilities for every child who learned differently from what the world expected. Their story had begun with abandonment and loss, but it would be remembered as a testament to the transformative power of seeing potential where others saw only problems, and finding in each other the courage to change not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone they touched. 10 years had passed since Margaret Hayes first sat alone on Millbrook Station's platform, clutching a satchel and the remnants of hope that felt as fragile as autumn leaves. Now, on a crisp October morning in 1895, Margaret Mitchell stood in the same spot, but everything else had transformed beyond recognition. The station itself had been expanded twice to accommodate the steady stream of visitors coming to observe. The Millbrook Institute, what had begun as a small railroad town, had grown into a destination for educators, parents, and policymakers from across the nation. But the changes went deeper than buildings and population growth. Margaret listened to the familiar sounds of the morning train arriving, bringing another group of teachers who would spend the next month learning methods that had revolutionized how America thought about education and human potential. In her hands she held a letter that would have seemed impossible to imagine during those dark hours of abandonment a decade earlier. "My dear Mrs. Mitchell," the letter began, written in the careful script of someone for whom English was a second language. "I am writing from Germany, where I have established a school based on the principles you and your husband developed in Millbrook. The children here, who were told they could never learn, are now teaching their methods to students in neighboring communities." Similar letters arrived weekly from across the globe. The Millbrook method, as it had come to be known, had spread to schools in England, France, Canada, and Australia. What had started as one woman's desperate attempt to find purpose after loss had become an international movement that challenged fundamental assumptions about learning, disability, and human capacity. "The delegation from Japan is particularly interested in your tactile learning systems," Sam said, approaching with the easy stride of a man who had found his place in the world. At 45, his hair showed silver at the temples, and the lines around his eyes spoke of years spent laughing with children and solving problems that others thought unsolvable. Margaret smiled at the sound of his voice, still feeling the same flutter of recognition that had marked their first real conversation on this very platform. "And what did you tell them? That the methods aren't magic, they're just based on paying attention to how individual minds actually work, instead of insisting they all work the same way." It was a philosophy that had taken them far beyond education. The adaptive tools Sam designed were now manufactured by companies in 4 states, providing independence to people with various physical challenges. Margaret's approach to individualized instruction had been adopted by hospitals, military training programs, and even factories seeking more effective ways to teach complex skills. But their greatest pride remained the children, now young adults, who had been their first students. Timothy Brennan, the boy who had once been labeled as learning disabled, had just completed his first year at the state university, studying to become a teacher himself. Sarah Fletcher, whose malformed hands had been seen as an insurmountable barrier to education, was working as an apprentice architect, her unique perspective on spatial relationships making her invaluable in designing buildings that accommodated people with various needs. Mrs. Mitchell. The voice belonged to Maria Santos, now 20 years old and visiting Millbrook with her own 6-year-old daughter. I wanted Eleanor to see where her mama learned that being different was something to celebrate. Margaret knelt to Elena's level, noting the child's careful, observant manner that reminded her so much of her mother at that age. Your mama was one of my very first students, Margaret told Elena. She taught me as much as I taught her about the different ways smart people can learn. Elena looked up at her mother with pride, then back at Margaret. Mama says you can't see with your eyes, but you see everything anyway. That's because your mama taught me to use all my senses, not just one. Would you like to learn how to read with your fingers as well as your eyes? As Elena's face lit up with curiosity, Margaret reflected on how naturally children accepted differences when they weren't taught to fear them. This had been one of the most important discoveries of their work, that prejudice and limitation were learned behaviors, not natural responses. The afternoon brought Margaret's favorite part of each day, her walk through the institute with Sam, observing the current students and planning for those who would come next. The original warehouse had been expanded into a campus of 5 buildings, including dormitories for students who traveled long distances, workshops for developing new adaptive tools, and a library that housed the most comprehensive collection of materials on alternative education methods in the world. But it was the sounds that told the real story of their success. In every classroom, Margaret heard the focused concentration of children engaged in learning that matched their individual strengths. No longer did she hear the frustrated sighs and self-doubt that had once characterized students who didn't fit traditional molds. We received the final report from the Congressional Education Committee, Sam said, as they paused outside the original classroom. They're recommending that federal funding be provided to establish Millbrook-style institutes in every state. Margaret felt a mixture of pride and responsibility at this news. National recognition had been beyond their wildest dreams when they'd started. But it also meant that thousands of children's futures would depend on how well they trained teachers and maintained the principles that made their methods effective. Are we ready for that kind of expansion? Sam considered the question seriously. We have the systems in place, the documentation, the trained instructors. But more importantly, we have proof that the methods work regardless of location or local conditions. This was true. Schools based on Millbrook principles had been successfully established in urban Chicago, rural Montana, and everywhere in between. The key had been training teachers, not just in specific techniques, but in the underlying philosophy of seeing each student as an individual with unique strengths rather than problems to be fixed. There's something else we need to discuss, Sam said, his tone suggesting importance. Dr. Reynolds from Harvard has formally invited us to establish a permanent research center there. Full funding, graduate student assistance, and the opportunity to work with the brightest minds in education. Margaret had been expecting this offer for months. Harvard's interest represented the ultimate academic validation of their work, the kind of opportunity that could influence educational policy for generations to come. It's an incredible honor, she said carefully. But Margaret smiled at how well Sam knew her thought processes. But it would mean leaving Millbrook, leaving the community that made all of this possible. It would mean becoming researchers and theorists instead of practitioners. They had reached their favorite spot on the hill overlooking the town, the place where they'd had so many important conversations over the years. Millbrook spread below them, prosperous and confident, proud of its role as the birthplace of educational innovation. "What does your heart tell you?" Sam asked, using the question that had guided so many of their decisions. "My heart tells me that our work here isn't finished. Yes, we've proven that the methods work, and yes, we've trained teachers who can carry them to other places. But there are still children who need us here, still innovations to be discovered, still barriers to be broken down." Sam nodded, understanding completely. "Besides, I think Harvard needs to come to us, not the other way around. If they want to study what we do, they should do it in the place where it actually happens." "Exactly. We can partner with them, collaborate, on research, share our findings. But Millbrook is where the real work gets done." As the sun began to set behind the familiar hills, Margaret and Sam made their way back toward town, passing students and teachers heading home after another day of learning that would have been impossible anywhere else just a decade earlier. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Daniel Hayes had met me at the station that day? Margaret asked. It was a question she'd posed before, usually when confronted with the magnitude of what their chance meeting had created. "I've stopped wondering about alternate histories," Sam replied. "I'm too grateful for the one we're living." Margaret squeezed his arm affectionately. "Even with all the challenges, the criticism, the political battles, the constant pressure to prove ourselves. Especially because of those things. Easy lives don't change the world." They had reached Morrison's Inn, where Mrs. Morrison, now in her 70s but still sharp as a tack, was holding court on the front porch with several visitors who'd come to learn about the town's transformation. "There go the folks who started it all," Mrs. Morrison was saying with obvious pride. "Showed up here broken and lost, and look what they built from nothing but stubbornness and caring about children." Margaret and Sam exchanged amused glances. Mrs. Morrison's version of their story had grown more dramatic with each telling, but the essence remained true. Two people had found each other at their lowest points and chosen to build something meaningful from their shared understanding of loss and recovery. That evening, in the comfortable sitting room of the house they'd built near the Institute, Margaret and Sam reviewed correspondence from schools around the world, planned curriculum for the next group of visiting teachers, and discussed adaptations that might help their newest students. But as they prepared for bed, their conversation turned to more personal matters. "I got a letter from Emily today," Sam said, referring to his sister who had finally emerged from her long grieving period and remarried. "A kind widower in Pennsylvania. How is she?" "Happy. Really genuinely happy for the first time since her first husband died. She says our work helped her understand that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means finding new ways to honor what you've lost while building something that serves the living." Margaret understood exactly what Emily meant. Her love for Robert had never diminished, but it had evolved from a source of pain into a source of strength that informed everything she did. Teaching children with challenges felt like a way of honoring his memory while creating hope for the future. "She's coming to visit next month," Sam continued. "Wants to see what we've built here." "I'd like that very much." Margaret settled against Sam's shoulder, listening to the quiet sounds of Millbrook settling into evening. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded. Not the lonely cry of abandonment she remembered from a decade earlier, but a welcoming note that promised connection and possibility. "Sam? Thank you. For what?" "For seeing me when I was invisible, for staying when you could have kept running, for believing we could build something beautiful from our broken pieces." Sam's arms tightened around her. "Thank you for teaching me that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone worth healing with." Outside their window, Millbrook dreamed its quiet dreams, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that human potential was limitless when met with understanding and support. The Millbrook Institute for Progressive Learning would continue to grow and evolve, eventually becoming the model for educational reform throughout the world. Margaret and Sam Mitchell would be remembered as pioneers who changed not just how children learned, but how society understood the value of human differences. But on that peaceful October night in 1895, they were simply two people who had found, in each other's brokenness, the seeds of extraordinary healing. They had begun as strangers, united only by abandonment and loss. They had become partners whose love had created ripple effects that would touch thousands of lives across generations. Margaret's journey from a train platform where she sat abandoned and blind to a position of international recognition as an educational innovator would inspire countless others facing their own dark moments. Her story proved that the worst day of your life might also be the beginning of your greatest contribution to the world, and Sam's transformation from a rootless drifter haunted by survivor's guilt to a master craftsman and devoted partner demonstrated that healing was possible even for wounds that seemed permanent. Together, they had written a story that began with the end of everything they thought they wanted and became the beginning of everything the world needed them to become. In choosing to see each other's potential rather than limitations, they had revolutionized how an entire society understood the difference between disability and difference, between accommodation and excellence, between settling for what is and fighting for what could be. Their love story had become humanity's gain, proving that sometimes the most profound acts of service to others grow from the soil of personal transformation. They had been broken when they found each other, but their willingness to heal together had created something far more valuable than individual wholeness. It had created hope for every person who had ever been told they were too different to matter. The train that had brought Margaret to Millbrook in desperation had ultimately carried her to a destiny she never could have imagined. And in the end, that was the most beautiful lesson of all, that our worst moments might actually be detours toward our greatest purpose, if we're brave enough to see them that way. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.